Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am honored to talk with Robert Garland. Robert is Emeritus Professor at Colgate University. He has his PhD from University College London. His main interests have been in ancient history and classics, and he's the author of numerous books, including the most recent, What to Expect When You're Dead, an ancient tour of death and the afterlife. And we talk all about it. We talk about how ancient cultures consider death. Where does humans' beginnings of understanding death come from? The process of dying, funerals, different cultural beliefs about the afterlife, caring for the bodies of the deceased, afterlife for non-believers, what about for folks that don't believe, and many other topics. As grim as the conversation topic sounds, Robert has such an interesting take on it, and I think I mostly agree with it. And so death is always a hard topic to discuss, but his book is great, and his way of discussing it, I think, is really, really the way to talk about hard topics. You can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. So subscribe to the Substack, share widely with your friends. All of that's much appreciated. And now I bring you Robert Garland. I am here with Robert Garland. Robert, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Xavier.
Yeah, absolutely. You got a wonderful book out, and the book is What to Expect When You're Dead: An Ancient Tour of Death and the Afterlife. And we're going to talk all about it. Before we do, just give listeners kind of summary or a snapshot of who you are professionally, academically, or anything that's particularly relevant.
Okay. Well, I'm an Emeritus Professor, Colgate University. I arrived in this country in 1986, and I've been here ever since. I retired 4 years ago. Previous to that, I'd done lots of other kinds of jobs, trained as an actor, professional gardener,
Wow.
Even a cleaner in the post office back in those days in London. But finally, I decided on an academic career, which I think was probably the right one. But I always think that there are lots of people that we could be, and we have to choose one of them. So I chose academics in the end.
Yeah, well, I think that's always a hard question, right? I always think of the Kierkegaard notion. You understand you're going to die, and then you realize you have all these options in life, and which one do you take? It's just like, which one do you do? And there's no right or wrong option. But I am happy that you did chose academics and that you wrote this book and that we're able to talk about it. I guess, the first thing we should probably mention here at the beginning. People don't like talking about death. They get very, which is understandable. We all die. We all fear death. Why do you think, aside from the obvious of like, oh, well, we're going to have an expiration date, people don't want to think about not existing anymore. But why do you think people nowadays, I guess, have a sort of fear of it? And how do you feel that, looking through history about how humans have treated death can help us understand, death and dying, today in the 21st century?
Well, I think to begin with, most of us think that probably, leaving aside death, the actual act of dying isn't too pleasant. So that's nothing that one would want to brush aside. You may die in a violent accident, in which case you probably don't feel a lot. But even with the guillotine coming down, there are those seconds that aren't going to be very pleasant. I think that's one big reason that runs throughout time, probably from Neolithic onwards. The other, I think, is that it's very difficult for many of us to think of the universe existing without us. And that is something that I think has prompted human beings to seek some sort of continuation beyond the biological existence that we have. I think there are lots of reasons that we can sort of look to the ancient world and find answers, some sense that, first of all, we're all in it together. Death is the great leveler. Whether you happen to be a Ramesses II or Donald Trump or plain old moi, we all end up in the same place, no matter what. That is to say, dead. So throughout history, and really I would say that probably at least 100,000 years ago, human beings were beginning to sort of think, well, what is all this about? What does death mean? Is there anything that continues after death and so forth? I mean, I think my number one answer to what you're suggesting, questioning, is that we have this sense of continuity with the ancient world, with everybody really who has ever lived, that in a sense unifies us. And the second thing is, I think that when we do ponder about the afterlife, if we happen to believe in the afterlife, and I'll say up front that I personally don't, although a recent Pew investigation determined that 70% of Americans do actually believe in the afterlife. So I have to say that my book is sort of an outlier in terms of what people are thinking, compared with the author, myself. Also, life is short. That is something that was certainly true in the ancient world to an extraordinary degree. I think that we in this country, and indeed throughout the world during the current coronavirus epidemic, came to realize that we could be brushed aside at any moment. Over 1,200,000 Americans died during that epidemic.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that sort of brought death home really to the whole nation in a way that probably it hadn't done previously. And certainly if you'd been living in the ancient world, life would have been much, much shorter. It's estimated, and this is putting a very general ballpark figure on it, that males lived longer by perhaps 5 to 10 years, died in their mid-40s, women typically in their mid-30s. Obviously, we enjoy a much longer lifespan, although it's worth noting that in the past few years, the lifespan in America has been declining, in fact, by as much as a year. So it's nothing that we should sort of take for granted, so to speak. But the brevity of human life, the uncertainty of human life, is also something I think that humans throughout history have shared with one another. So what else can we learn from the ancient world? I think that to face death fearlessly, actually, to go back to your point, certainly in the ancient world, you knew that you could die at any moment through accident or disease or warfare, etc. Obviously, many people face all those today, but fortunately, we in America don't face all those. But nonetheless, life is uncertain, and we should never forget that. Finally, I would go with what the Roman poet Horace said always, carpe diem, as a result. Seize the day. You just don't know whether tomorrow will be there awaiting you.
Yeah, no, I firmly agree with that. I think, especially as I get older, life is, we're terribly durable and resilient, but at the same time, life is a gift, and it's super fragile, right? And so, and I think one of the things I was thinking about when reading the book was, it was true 50,000 years ago, and it's true today. Of course, we have a lot of fail safes in place, if you will, but in some ways we don't.
Exactly.
And so
Yes.
it's such an interesting way we've evolved there.
I'd like to just say one more thing in response to the first question, and that is that I don't actually find death a miserable subject to talk about one bit.
Okay.
I didn't get into the subject because I'm a sort of a lugubrious personality whatsoever. On the contrary, I find it enlivening, enriching. It emphasizes, by the point that you've just made, life is brief, all the more reason, therefore, to take joy in it. And death at one's shoulder, as it always is, does not make you melancholy, I don't find. I spent a lot of years, my PhD and first book was about death. And it has not in any way done other than to give me, I would like to say, an enhanced sense of what it is to be alive.
Yeah, it's certainly a different perspective, right? Because you're around it, you're thinking about it, you're writing about it, and saying, "Oh, I see." I would imagine you see it a bit different. So take us through this journey here a bit. So you give an overview, I think, in the beginning of the book of many early cultures. I mean, you don't have to go through each one, but you talk about Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Hindu, Jewish, Zoroastrian, Greek, Roman, so many different cultures and religious groups and things like that. I guess you can talk about, whatever you want about, where you started, who you decided to kind of mention and highlight, and you do throughout the book. I guess the question I have about all of these early human cultures, belief systems is, I guess, what's the through line or consistency in all of these cultures about how they were viewing death? Obviously, we're going to see difference in terms of funeral rites and preparation and afterwards and burial and all these things. Sure, but what do you find, or in looking at all these, the consistency in all those different groups?
Well, I should say that I'm trained as a classicist. That is to say, I study ancient Greece, ancient Rome. So that was my starting point. But I've become increasingly interested in recent years in other ancient cultures. And, many students of the ancient world tend to focus on perhaps Greece or Rome, or maybe Greece and Rome, but don't often stray beyond those contours. And I thought that with this subject, it was appropriate to do so. And once I began to investigate it, I began to find lots of consistencies between them, differences as well. In fact, the whole exercise in studying this subject is about both consistency and difference. But the consistencies, in a way, are what drives the whole academic exercise. And let me just sort of answer your question a bit further by sort of outlining some of the things that I think are remarkably consistent across the board, so to speak, though with certain differences. Number one would be the fact that the dead are needy for attention. They just don't leave us alone, okay? They certainly didn't leave people alone in the ancient world. If you think of the Egyptians, for a start, for instance, it was very important for a dead Egyptian to be assured that she would be receiving food and drink from the closest relatives. And if that were not the case, then, well, we're not really told what would happen, but we could imagine that it will not be very pleasant for that dead person. Now, a difference here is that in Homeric times, whatever that quite means, we don't really know, but in the Homeric poems, which tell us a lot about death, especially Book 11 of the Odyssey, when Odysseus descends to Hades, to the underworld, which, by the way, is very bleak. It's dark. It's no sun, of course. Everybody's pretty miserable down there. They're not being punished, except for a few really bad felons. But most people are living a cheerless existence. But the thing here is that they're not in touch with the living. And there's no evidence of people bringing food in the Homeric poems to the dead. So what the dead do when they see Odysseus coming down, they scramble towards him. They have to drink the blood so that they communicate with Odysseus. But once they do so, then they're eager to ask questions. What's going on up there? Because they don't get news of the living down below. That all changes, actually, by the classical period, because at that point, Athenians are expected to bring food and drink to the tombs of their relatives. So we see this again in terms of consistency and difference, but an overriding desire on people's part is to give what the dead require, because the dead are needy. I mean, even the depositing of flowers on a grave, in some sense, is a continuation, sort of etiolated continuation, a sort of vestigial remains of the thought that the dead need something from the living. and that they are contactable by the living. The living, too. The second thought, really, here is that we can contact the dead. And if we do so, they will help us. And perhaps if we ignore them, they will do harm to us. That thread runs through a lot of cultures as well. Again, an outrider is early Hebrew culture, where, again, the dead are not available and apparently not needy either. But generally in ancient cultures, the desire for the living to be in contact with the dead, for the dead to request something from the living, is pretty constant. Also, it is a fact that the dishonoring of the dead is something that universally cultures deplore. It is done, of course, at times. For instance, in the Iliad, when Achilles drags the body of Hector, who killed his best friend Patroclus, attaches it to the chariot and drives it around the walls of Troy. That is a terrible, shameful action. But outside of warfare, the honoring of the dead is something that prevails in all cultures. And it's true of every culture I study, Mesopotamian, Hindu, etc. All require the living to honor the dead. Whether or not I would say you happen to be an atheist or a non-believer in terms of the afterlife, the dead are to be honored. That is something that goes beyond any kind of religious belief. And I think it was the case from very, very early time, when we find evidence that the dead were being treated with respect in terms of burial, in terms of gifts, and so forth.
Is this more, as I'm listening to this, is this more for the people that remain afterwards, right? Do we find that this is their way of trying to make peace with it, or finding something where that the dead are needy for things, or that they deserve honor, things like that? I mean, it seems like it's maybe not, that it's less about the person that's passed, but more about the people that remain behind to have a certain memory, to have a certain way of interacting, how they can be okay. I mean, how much do you think it's more about the person that's behind, or really the person that has gone on?
I think it's about both. I mean, yes, there is a sense, of course, that you're doing this for the dead, but there's also, psychologically speaking, the living mourners at a funeral, but when they're, in other ways, believing that they're in contact with the dead, of course, there is a psychological benefit, a strong psychological benefit, I think, for the living. So I think that much of what is done for the dead is, in fact, intended unconsciously to benefit the living. For instance, we find it very difficult to believe that a close tie with someone, or even an animal, will not be somehow healed in the afterlife, and therefore that there is gratification of a deep kind in believing that you are somehow still in contact with the dead, that the dead are reachable. The dead are, if they're not actually responding, nonetheless they are aware of the continuation of love. Because love is at the heart of this in some ways. You cannot, there's no point in all the effort that is made in disposing of the dead and building monuments to them and so forth, unless love were at the core. So I think your question is absolutely relevant and central to how we regard the dead, that we do so because we ourselves, as mourners, derive enormous benefit. Just think of, placing a cinerary urn on your mantelpiece of Uncle Harold or something, having Uncle Harold in the home is reassuring. It means that in some ways, something of him is close beside you.
It's interesting for some people. I've heard the opposite also as well. Some people don't like it. It says, "Oh yeah," but a lot of people, it's comfort. They're still there. We don't want to let go of people that we care about and love, of course.
I would not have Uncle Harold passed away. I think I'm perfectly prepared to scatter his ashes from Beachy Head in England or something. I think that's where he belongs.
Yeah, yeah. So, where do we see, I guess, the earliest kind of accounts or earliest ideas of death in I know some of this stuff, is dependent on things being written down, whether it's on a papyrus scroll or whether it's on a tablet or whether it's on, whatever parchment. But, you mentioned some sites in Israel going maybe as far back as 120,000 BCE. Obviously, we have I think one of the reasons the Epic of Gilgamesh is so important is because we can learn a lot of things about, or have some clues or ideas about, very early on. It's one of the oldest documents we have. But more so, you can just chat about that. But you can bring us to Egypt, because they had very late, or I should say early, a whole arrangement of how they prepared for death. A lot of people know about mummification and the tombs and the pyramids and things like that. But it's pretty old. It's actually pretty old, maybe third millennium, BC. So
Right.
yeah, and they did a interesting job of documenting things. They don't have massive books they wrote necessarily in the way we think about it today, but they did document things. So yeah, maybe tell us the earliest pieces where we see
Right.
death and honoring death, and maybe get us to the Egyptians.
Certainly. We basically have two sources of evidence, as you indicated there. We have the literary evidence and we have the archaeological evidence. I'll begin with the archaeological evidence, because that goes back further. I love to sort of do thought experiments and to imagine when it was that the first hominin, that is to say, the first human connected with Homo sapiens, not necessarily Homo sapiens, but Homo erectus, whatever it might have been, first sort of scratched her head and said, "You know what? Is this the end?"
Mm.
Abstract thinking began really with that, or the imagination started to work on things that could not be seen and touched and directly experienced. And certainly there is a possibility that it goes back, in fact, to the Middle Paleolithic period, 430,000 years ago. Perhaps, because it's very difficult to determine when you find skeletons of that age as to whether they've been deliberately buried or whether they've just been accidentally buried. But there is a possibility that there was 28 burials found in Spain in the, it's called the Cima de los Huesos, cave of the dead, so to speak, of the bones. And a collective burial was found there, which may suggest it's a sort of kind of early cemetery. However, it's also possible that the people died as the result of some kind of accident. It's been postulated that this was the result of a mud flow, for instance, which sort of swept them away. The earliest, I think, definite evidence for deliberate, intentional burial, as you pointed out, comes from Israel, from a place called Skull, appropriately Skhul, which is south of Haifa. And that dates, as you suggested, to about 100,000 BC. And this is Homo sapiens. And as I say, it's probably, I think at this point, the earliest intentional burial that paleontologists can really assert was intentional. And that is because across the chest of a young boy was found the mandible of a wild boar. Now, the next question is, does that mean that there was a belief in the afterlife, that the child or the young adult was going to use that on a hunting expedition, say, just as he might have used it on a hunting expedition when he was alive? Or was it just, so to speak, a very personal item because, of course, it's very common to this day to bury people with a personal item, irrespective of whether you believe that personal item is going to serve them in the life to come. So that, and then another example, my third example would be the Shanidar cave in Iraq, which is dated about 45 to 30,000 BC. And this is a Neanderthal burial. So the Neanderthals, as we are increasingly realizing, are very close cousins, and that we have, it's estimated, between 4 and 6 Neanderthal DNA in our bodies. So, good for the Neanderthals. And there's an interesting burial there that was found, which I think today is discredited, but nonetheless a deliberate burial known as the flower burial, because remains, pollen of flowers were found there. But subsequently archaeologists have decided, or paleontologists have decided, that these were perhaps introduced subsequent to the burial, or were part of what were in the flowers to begin with, or that rodents and other animals somehow got in there and left something. So it's not certain that that was the case. But another burial in the same cave, Shanidar, showed that a person who had been disabled was being had lived several years after the injury that they suffered, but they had been cared for. So I like to think that burial and care for those weaker than ourselves actually may have evolved at the same time. Passing to literature, yes, you mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, which in its earliest version, its Sumerian version, goes back to the early 3rd millennium BCE. And that wonderful epic, I love to teach it.
It's a great epic. I reread it. Well, reread it. I reread it last year, but did it on audiobook because I wanted to hear, because it's an audio tradition, or excuse me, an oral tradition. And the audiobook was okay. I mean, unfortunately, it wasn't like a great reading of it, but it does hit different when you hear it and listen, as opposed to just reading it. It's much different.
As you would have in the time heard it orally, of course, people wouldn't be picking up penguin copies of it and that sort of thing. So it would have been powerful, I think, because not only hearing it read professionally, but also in a group as well. And it's all about the search for immortality, because Gilgamesh is 2/3 a god, 1/3 a man. So he says to himself, well, I'm halfway there already. I might as well go for the whole hog and become immortal. And it's the cost that, firstly, the cost, he loses his best friend, Enkidu, as a result of the journey to discover immortality, but also he's humbled by it as well, because he's forced to realize that he is merely a weak mortal. Nonetheless, as a weak mortal, he can still do good things. He can still be a good king to his people. It's an extraordinary tale of richness and of depth of understanding of the human condition. And I always think it's good to put it beside the Iliad, which it clearly influenced, because in Book 9 of the Iliad, Achilles, he's approached by an embassy to get him to return to the battle, and he's come to the realization that, he says, a man dies whether he applies himself to hard work in fighting, and if he doesn't, so what's it all about? So he is also considering what is the human lot, so to speak. But he decides, of course, he uniquely has the choice between living a long life and dying young and being remembered forever. And he decides to be remembered forever, kleos aphteton, to leave an imperishable memory. And that is something which in the Odyssey he seems to regret, because when Odysseus comes down there, he says, I'd rather be a person working for another, in other words, the lowest in the totem pole, than lord of all the dead. So, yes, literature and archaeology, and you mentioned Egypt. Now, of course, Egypt is extraordinarily important in the history of how death was treated, what was the beliefs about the afterlife. And I think that all goes back to the soil of Egypt, because Egyptian soil is hot. And that means if you place a body in the soil It desiccates, but it doesn't rot.
Mm.
And just on a personal note, my interest in death goes back nearly 70 years, I would say, to when I went to the British Museum for the first time and saw a dead body who was called Ginger in those days, but that has become politically incorrect. Now he's just EA, Egyptian Antiquities, 32751. And he died in 3400 BC. And he was in the fetal position, that is to say, like a little baby in the womb. And he was also placed there with certain grave goods, perhaps because he would need these in the afterlife, including beaker and wheat and that kind of thing. So it may be that was the very beginnings of the Egyptian belief that a dead body could be brought back to life. Because when you look at Ginger, he's got little tufts of ginger hair, he's got tattoos on his arm, in this fetal position, but he looks as if he could wake up at any second. He just, a little bit dried out, one has to admit. But apart from that, perfect condition. So I think, again, some Egyptians sort of thought, well, this is maybe a suggestion that we should try to do this generally. And then they set off on the false course of mummifying bodies, of course. And 1,000 years later, they were doing that. The first mummies were found at a place called Hierakonpolis in Egypt. And I say that was a false road to go down because, in actual fact, once you mummify a body and place it in a coffin, then it becomes subject to all kinds of procedures which will cause it to rot eventually. But the Egyptians, I think, were enormously important in the story of how human beings decided to confront the afterlife. And of course, the Egyptians did so basically by saying, well, you need your body, but if you've got your body, then you can continue using it in the world to come.
Let's talk about actual dying for a brief moment. I mean, people have argued about this. If somebody asks, so what does it mean to die? That's a kind of complicated question, actually. Your heart will stop. Eventually, your brain stops. You get the rigor mortis eventually. Then we're in this in-between. And so you're not fully gone. Again, this is sort of different for everybody, depending on what the issue is. But yeah, you could still have. I mean, you've heard stories about people on planes or in the hearse or whatever. You start to hear these noises. People are twitching still afterwards. Our bodies. There's a long in between, which is you could understand why people have these ideas of limbo, purgatory, all this stuff. But yeah, what's that process? When someone closes their eyes and they don't open them again, they're not gone yet. Their body's still reacting of sorts. It can sometimes take a while. Usually we have the whole, the heart flatlines. But even there, right? We've brought people back. They flatline, we bring them back, where, and no one really knows where they're at, of course. You hear stories of those sorts. And even if someone's heart has stopped and then completely flatlined, the brain usually takes a little bit of time to shut off after that. And then your body's having these reactions. So, when to ask, well, what is it? What is death? What is the actual physical piece of it? It's just that's kind of hard to explain a bit, or we've had a hard time explaining it. How do you kind of navigate that?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and it's one of the topics that makes me amuses me a little bit. I have to say, even though it's not always very amusing for the persons concerned, but. Let's just go back to the ancient world for a moment. You mentioned things like the actual blurring of distinction today. People can, in kind of medical terms, virtually be brought back from the dead. They can flatline, as you say, then they can revive or something.
Yeah.
Now, in the ancient world, you did not have the means to determine whether people actually had snuffed it. Off the twig or whatever metaphor we use, or whether they were just sort of basically unconscious at that moment. And, well, that brings one to the big question as to how accurately people could determine death in the ancient world. And I think that answer has to be said with not very great accuracy. Pliny, who was an author of a vast encyclopedia of knowledge on all kinds of topics called The Natural History, mentions instances of people who basically came back from the dead. One person, for instance, was being cremated and suddenly jumped up as a result. And, said, hey, wait a minute, I'm not quite at that point yet. Rumors of my death are premature, as I believe Mark Twain said. Anyway, or maybe someone else, I can't remember. But, certainly in the ancient world, we then get, of course, the reports of people being revived, Jesus performing miracles, raising the dead, but others did so as well.
Yep.
There was a mystic called Apollonius of Tyana, who revived a young woman who died on her wedding day, although his biographer, Philostratus, thinks that this was not the case, that he detected signs of life. And that might well have been the case, that, signs of life were detected and somebody said this person's alive and then got the credit for sort of reviving them, bringing them back from the dead. But I think it would have been extremely difficult in the ancient world. And on a very somber note, especially in times of plague, say, when there was a great need to dispose of bodies quickly, how much care did people take to determine whether someone was dead? It's been an issue, I would say, throughout history and continues to be till this day. When I was doing my research, somebody was reported as having been placed in a coffin and then banged on the coffin. Unfortunately, somebody heard them. But the fear of being buried alive was very, very acute, of course, in the Victorian period. And although I don't go into the Victorian period in my book, that lies a little bit outside my chronological range. Nonetheless, there was a interesting book which was written by two people called William Tebb and Edward Vollum, which provided certain guides, certain tests that one should apply to determine whether someone was dead, one of which was tickling. If you tickle someone, they're likely to come back to life. Okay. Another method was a hypodermic injection, an electric current to be passed through, etc., etc. In Zoroastrianism, must mention Zoroastrianism at some point during this talk, there's something called the Stag-Did test, which is the dog sight ceremony. It literally means bring a dog into the room and it sniffs, and it will be able to determine whether that person is dead.
Wow.
I don't know that that's been tried in this country recently, but nonetheless, I believe it is still done by Zoroastrians.
Wow.
So, the question about death as not being a precise and absolute moment continues to this day, with medical research becoming more and more sensitive to this sort of interim period which exists between life and death. And that brings up another subject, which is something that is also very important in understanding approaches in the afterlife from ancient sources. And that is that this was sort of allowed for in the sense that there was a strong belief that death is a process and not an event. And that between life and death, there is a period which anthropologists call the liminal period, from the Latin word limen, which means a threshold, during which the moribund person is passing from this life into the next. An extended period of time, that's to say, it's maybe as much as 24 hours. And in that period, it is the duty of the living to ensure that that person passes from the living state to the dead state and gets fully incorporated in the next life.
Yeah, we see different ideas of that too, and different cultures have different ideas about what that is. Which, again, you could, if you're taking just the pure, human perspective. If humans at different times, and we're still trying to do it, trying to figure out, okay, where is this person? They're not completely here, but are they somewhere else? Are they not? Are they just trying to figure it out? You could see how these ideas arise.
It's going to be complicated, if I may just say so, by AI, of course, which possesses a function of making a sort of an image of the dead, putting words into the dead, etc., that you can keep with you, so that you can sort of have a conversation with the dead, with voice recognition sort of thing, etc., etc. So I think that we are, we're condemned, I would say, to forever be somewhat uncertain about what death actually is.
Yeah. Now, tell us about kind of the funeral, the aspect of, okay, someone, they've died, okay, and people for a long time, and we let's pause and say, not even just humans. I think Neanderthals have maybe some idea of some aspect of this. Obviously, we know about some of the great apes have some aspect of doing this. Elephants,
yes.
So other animals appear to be doing something. Maybe it's not fully funeral how we describe it, but there's something going on about after one of their own has passed. They're doing something, right? At the very least,
Yeah.
So this does seem to transcend, and there is an interesting idea. I talked to a philosopher. I'm forgetting the name. Monceau, Susanna Monceau, I think that's her name. And she has this idea of how animals can have the concept of death, right? And there's a form of abstraction there and all these things. And it's very interesting. Her book is very interesting, and she's written some wonderful papers about. So this idea goes, I guess, beyond humans, but for humans, I mean, you've been to funerals. I've been to funerals. Most people listening have been to funerals, unfortunately, and it's a part of life and all these things. But I'm always interested at how people do things differently. They do funerals differently, and I'm curious about that. Of why have humans done this? Why do they do it differently? We continue to do it, even for people nowadays that are maybe not too particularly religious. They could have been agnostic their whole life. They could have, maybe they were raised in some kind of church or something, a religious place, but they just weren't religious. And then many people have some religious component to it. It's in a church. It's in a, there's somebody that has to do a blessing or prayer or whatever. And I'm just, that alignment there of dying in some kind of religious practice, even if the person isn't religious, seems pretty strong. And that can look different, I guess, around the world. But yeah, tell us about the whole funeral process. I mean, I think some folks will know that many Muslims, they'll wrap the body in a white cloth and dispose of it. There's all these different ways, but we do have this idea of funerals. I mean, some people have long wakes. Some people carry the body through the street. I mean, there's all these interesting things. Yeah, tell us about how different cultures do this and why, though, we're all doing some variant of funerals.
Yes. Another interesting question. Nancy Mitford, who wrote an absolutely splendid book called The American Way of Death, pointed out that Americans kind of sublimate death. That is to say, you go to the funeral home, it's called, as if, the dead is in a place where she or he feels comfortable, very like where they would have been when alive. That is a particular approach to death, which is, to dress the body. That has been a pretty constant feature in many human societies, that, you present the dead for the, I won't say the delectation, that would not be quite the right word, but for the appreciation of the living, so that they see the dead looking their best, so to speak. That is fairly constant throughout society. Jewish people, like others, have to bury the body within 24 hours, so there isn't much opportunity to do that. But in other societies, there is a ritual, of course, of visiting the body and having it laid out and washed and so forth. And in Greek society, often a crown was placed on the dead, so that they really would look their finest, so to speak. Because I think there is it goes back to the need both to honor the dead and also to sort of demonstrate that this person who was part of your family is someone of importance, we could say as well. So that this ceremony is both to demonstrate that you are part of a family that is important because the dead themselves were also important and they are valued. In Roman society, it was customary for the son, typically the son, to deliver a funeral oration, a eulogy, in the Roman Forum. And in the procession towards the Forum, it was customary for people to wear masks, imagines they were called, which represented former family members, to show the whole line of descent, so to speak, which was noble, of course. You wanted to make that point off. So it was very much a manner of demonstrating a family's value, etc. An Egyptian funeral, we know also about the details there, culminated, of course, in a ceremony known as the opening of the mouth, because if the mouth could be opened, then the deceased could receive food, which was essential for their welfare in the world to come. In Britain today, it's often said that death is sort of denied. It's almost sort of not made much of. Britain is notoriously a post-Christian society. It has the lowest number of churchgoers, I think, in any Christian country, percentage-wise. But nonetheless, as you also point out, there is no move to take away from the Church of England in this case, its traditional role in the sense of handling the dead. A few people, of course, sometimes say, I don't want God mentioned in any funeral service, but very few people conduct private ceremonies for their dead outside the control of religion. And of course, when I use the word control, that is very important because what is religion? It is both a belief in God and a belief in the afterlife. Those two things are indissoluble, I think. And so this is the moment as well when religion comes to the fore and provides both a resource, sense of strength at a time of need, but also a certain degree as well of conformity, which can also pass into a degree of coercion as well. A moment ago, you were talking about purgatory. I don't think I picked up on that, but of course, that was a belief that you could, in your intermediate stage, pass from one to another, but you had to go through purgatory, a sort of a metaphorical liminal place. It wouldn't be called liminal, metaphorical in the eyes of the Church. Belief in purgatory does not figure very prominently today, I think, in discussions about Catholic eschatology, but nonetheless, it's still on the books, so to speak. So, yes, I think overall, I think funerals, to go back to the previous question you asked, both serve the dead, but also serve the living. And there's a lovely little line in Homer when Patroclus is being buried. Homer says, many people mourn using Patroclus as an excuse. Patroclon profassin. In other words, when we go to a funeral, we may be thinking of other people as well, and that's perfectly legitimate. Other people who have died, and we express our grief in a universal way, I think, at a funeral, not simply for the person there whom we are honoring.
Yeah, it does feel more for everyone else around the person that's gone than the person that has passed. It's more of like a support kind of system, a communal thing.
Yes.
It seems to take more saliency for folks that are still mourning the person they loved.
Mm-hmm.
So much about you spend a handful of chapters actually on it, which is important. Is the afterlife. So I mean, at the end, I mean, I'm of the belief we don't really know what's there after we die. There's a lot of nice ideas, but some people really. I mean, people believe it as real as I'm talking to you now, which the belief systems in our brain are pretty strong. But you have the Egyptian field of reeds, the Etruscan afterlife, Hades, Elysium, Sheol. Obviously, you have heaven and hell on the Christian side, the Islamic Jannah. There's so many ways that everyone's got an afterlife, right? Everyone seems to have an afterlife. And what's going on in the afterlife? Some people believe that, there's even diversity of thought in the Christian form. Some people believe that you live forever in eternity in heaven with everybody that made it, that made the cut. But some people believe that you burn eternally in hell. Some people believe eventually you burn for a long time and then you die in hell. I'm getting a bit in the weeds here, right? About some of the theology here, some of the eschatology, but yeah, I think it was Augustine that believed in it. You eventually die, and then afterwards, people came and said, no. If you live forever in heaven, you burn eternally in hell, things like that. So even within some of these systems, you have difference of ideas. And so I know in the Jewish culture, there's not much made about the afterlife. I mean, Sheol is mentioned, but it's not really expanded on, is my understanding. Elysium is an interesting thing. Even, I'll just say as a something kind of fun here of sorts, but even oh God, I'm going to forget the name. Even Tolkien wrote that the elves had an afterlife that they went to afterwards.
I didn't know.
Oh my goodness, I'm drawing a blank on it. It's gonna bother me, but it's referenced in the last movie and in the show and things like that. So, anyways, there's all these ideas of an afterlife, and so why do most cultures and belief systems have this idea of an afterlife, and then what's going on in the afterlife? So you mentioned also that Sumerians had some form of judgment. The Egyptians had some judgment. Christians have some judgment. Then there's judging going on in the afterlife. So we suffer on earth, and then we're judged for it. And the afterlife.
Doesn't seem fair, does it?
But some people, it's not that. It's not judgment. It's reward, and it's bliss, and it's
Right.
forever. All these things. So yeah, tell us about why belief systems have their version of an afterlife, and it seems kind of more of an anthropological human thing. And then what people think is different folks think is going on in the afterlife.
Well, I'd like to know what elves do in the afterlife.
I have to find what it's called, but it's a name.
Right.
Yeah, but that's really good because elves are eternal, right? They're immortal, excuse me. And so at a certain point, they move on into wherever it is. It will come to me.
Well, again, another magnificent question. I had a chapter in the book, what you can do in the afterlife, and that's before talking about individual afterlives. To me, that's the big question. What can you do? Can you eat?
Mm-hmm.
Can you have sex?
Yeah, are we with our loved ones? Are they all waiting for us? Right? You know, all
Yes.
these things. Are my pets up there? You know, you're right.
Now that is the really big question. I was just looking at something the other day, and the big question was: do animals go to hell? Because or all animals good, and they go to heaven, or indeed, are there any animals in heaven?
Mm-hmm.
Do some animals, to use your admirable expression, make the cut?
Right.
And
Right.
bad pets that bite,
Right. Yeah.
they go somewhere else. The undiscovered country from whom no traveler returns, as Shakespeare puts it. It is extraordinary that there is so much that has been thought about, written about, in terms of what lies beyond the grave. And it's fascinating anthropologically, of course.
Yeah.
But what does it add up to in the end? The most elaborate systems that I was able to really work on is Islamic beliefs, Islamic eschatology, which is very, very detailed indeed.
Mm-hmm.
And without picking on Islam, I mean, most afterlives are what the culture wants them to be. So that seems to me to be a fairly, at least if we're talking about heaven, I'm not talking about hell at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But let's go back in time. Again, it's really the Egyptians who set the ball rolling. Initially, it was merely the afterlife was the preserve of the pharaohs, but by the second millennium BC, it began to be democratized. And that meant that initially members of Pharaoh's circle and his highest officers were also admitted to the afterlife. And then gradually, the entire Egyptian population felt that it had a stake in the afterlife. So that goes with, as well, the belief that you had to prove yourself worthy. And there again, the Egyptians were out there in the lead because they came up with the idea that the dead had to present themselves before Osiris, the god of the dead, in a court of law at which they would be judged by 42 assessors who would question them as to their moral uprightness. They'd ask questions like, have you ever stolen? Have you ever mistreated a woman? Etc., etc., etc. And to all of these questions, if you had any sense, you would say no. And if your judgment passed, what would happen was that your heart, the little image of a heart we see in Egyptian paintings, is weighed against Maat, which is a feather which represents truth. And if your heart is heavier than the truth, then, sorry, mate, you're not going to the field of reeds. Instead, Amit, who is a kind of monster with sort of crocodile and lion and other bits, a composite monster, will devour you. And that will be that. In other words, there's no hell. There's only a heaven for people who pass. However, there was always recourse to the spells. Egyptians were very big on spells, of course, and they would inform you, if you buy this book and you practice this spell, you'll get through the negative confession no matter what. But we have there the blueprint, really, for other systems of belief, including Zoroastrianism, including Hinduism, including Christianity, including Islam as well, to name but a few. In the Greek world, Hades was a place of darkness to which everybody went, as I mentioned, irrespective, initially, of their goodness or bad. It's only around the beginning of the, let's say, 6th century that things change and a belief arises that there is a bifurcation, that some people will go here and some people will go there. And that comes about, who knows why, but it is instilled in a system of belief that arises that is known as the mystery religions, of which the most important was at Eleusis, a township just west of Athens, 30 miles, say, and less than that, 15 miles, I think it is. And there you would undergo initiation, and you would, if you passed the initiation ceremonies, you would be promised blessedness in the hereafter. Whatever that meant, we just don't know. And from that moment on, the Greeks had a sense of there being an afterlife that was divided. Jews, no. There was no such judgment for Jews, it seems. There's no evidence of it whatsoever. Sheol is the place where everybody goes, even Samuel goes down there, good man. And he's there with presumably everybody else who's not so good. When we come to Christianity, it's important to recognize that Jesus doesn't really say much about hell. There is a reference to burning, but it's not clear that this really means that you will eternally burn, as Christians have suggested. On the contrary, I think it's quite likely that he just thought that this would be a temporary phase, after which, rather like the Egyptians, you would cease to exist. It's only when we come to the 2nd century that belief in a afterlife that is full of terrors for the wicked begins to gain serious traction. And of course, that goes on and on, finds its fullest kind of statement in the Council of Florence in the Middle Ages, where it is determined that, non-believers, heretics, and Jews will be sent to hell. Islam is, as I said, extraordinary in the detail which it has determined await both the people who pass the test and those who don't. And Jannah, which is the equivalent of heaven, is rather like a cultivated garden where you are waited upon by servants, where there are beautiful women available, etc., where you will be at the peak of your physical prowess, etc., etc. Now, that's very interesting. Whether that's exactly what awaits anybody from any of these religions is uncertain. A scholar called Christoph Luxemburg says that the well-known suggestion that you'll be, the pure will be greeted by virgins in the afterlife is a mistranslation of a Syriac word, which actually means white grapes, and that you will, in fact, as one of the blessed, be given white grapes to consume, a delicacy, in other words, rather than all those virgins. To this day, hell is still a part of teaching in the Catholic Church, although Pope Francis, to his credit, when he was interviewed by a reporter about hell, said, there is no hell, there is only the disappearance of sinful souls. This was speedily repudiated by the Catholic authorities, who said the Pope, bless him, was not speaking ex cathedra, in which case his pronouncement would have been official church teaching, but merely, so to speak, as a private citizen. So the church
I want to know how they delineate between the two of those. That's very interesting there.
Well, I wouldn't like to pronounce on that myself. Certainly.
Oh boy.
Well, bless Pope Francis. I do hope he recovers.
Yeah. I do want to say, in hearing about how people have, different groups have these ideas of the afterlife. When you kind of start with some of the earliest, let's say the Egyptians here for a minute, And you said that how the Islamic tradition is a bit more detailed. It does seem that maybe intentionally or unintentionally, each one just builds off of each other and just gets more and more detailed, which is a sort of kind of, again, an anthropological thing of like, well, we have the very early, this one group here in Egypt, their belief system. Now, to be fair, I mean, my understanding is that, Egyptians have a pretty, robust cosmology. I mean, they had a really, really, with the Nile and where, all the things with Egypt and where it sits. And they were very concerned about that throughout life, and so they had a whole system developed. But as it goes throughout time, these different belief systems or groups sort of build on each other, and it becomes more distinct, and it becomes more specific, and it is so it's not surprising. I've always said that Muslims are kind of the new kid on the block still, so to speak, of most religions, right? We're talking 7th century AD, not 3rd millennium BCE. So yeah, they're one of the last major religions, and so in terms of formation, and so it's not surprising that it would have more specificity. It kind of makes intuitive sense.
Yeah, absolutely, and there is a parallel here because, of course, the Quran. Muhammad treats the prophets, beginning with Adam, and including, of course, Jesus, as precursors of him, the last prophet.
Right.
And, so clearly the Quran is a learned work in some ways. That is to say, it has built off Judaism, it has built off Christianity. It wouldn't be the work it was if the author had not been very conversant with the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And so it is indeed a work that has been in gestation through assimilation of previous religious ideas. And that pertains not only to the incorporation of stories, narratives, and ideas, but also specifically as well to a much more developed afterlife, which is also nonetheless something that shows points in common, certainly with Christianity, and therefore has, one might say, if I may, without insulting Muslims, kind of a debt to previous religions as being, as you say, the last major religion so far.
So, I was going to say, so far, I mean, there's still time.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it definitely, you see that. I mean, I think, Jesus has, numerous references in the Quran and, spoken about very, very highly, very positively. Yeah.
And the Virgin Mary, yes.
Yeah. So one of the last questions here is, so after someone has died, then when people have had the funeral, there's all these different ways in which people care for the body, right? The cremation, mummification. You're talking about some more lesser known forms, which is interesting. Obviously, we have burial and things like that, and we get to this idea. Some people, again, like I mentioned, will wrap in a white linen cloth and dispose. Some people will. Sometimes there's mass kind of burials. Sometimes it's, we have this idea of 6 feet under for individuals, then, people. And then there's this other kind of connected thing of keeping the dead close, right? And some of that piece of it as well. Yeah, just tell us about some of these aspects of actual, burial, disposing of the body, keeping them close after they've died. How does this work for different, belief systems?
Basically, there's a limited number of ways that one can get rid of a body. You can bury it in the ground. You can burn it, cremation. You can preserve it, as the Egyptians did. You could leave it out to be devoured by beasts and birds, which is what Zoroastrians do. Final method of getting rid of the body is to eat it, which is recorded. But all what is interesting to me is, why choose one method rather than another? Is it to do with eschatology? Is it to do with religious belief? Now, to some extent, of course, it is. Particularly Catholics and Orthodox Christians. Catholics, until recently, would not permit a body to be cremated because they believe that, according to Christian teaching, the resurrection of the body requires a body. And to this day, Orthodox Christians still bury their dead for the same reason, really.
Right.
Now, that is, however, not by any means uniform. What I mean is that it is not uniform that eschatology rules the roost, so to speak. Certain cultures have changed over time without any change in belief system whatsoever. And this seems to have been this was the case, certainly in terms of the ancient Greeks. They go from inhumation to cremation to inhumation to cremation, etc. And nothing is changing. What must be changing is fashion, rather like, any kind of clothing fashion or fashion of any other sort. It doesn't seem to have any other motive behind it. What might be generating it is economy. Cremation tends to be more expensive than inhumation. But today, of course, cremation is taking over. Why? Because there is a pressure on land. So there's another economic motive going on as well, a reverse one to why cremation was less fashionable at certain times of history because wood is costly, etc., etc. So overall, however, I don't think there is any sort of real clear evidence that how you treat the body is making any difference in terms of religious belief. So what other factors are at stake? As I say, economy, but also fashion. This takes us into the area, of course, of funerary monuments and so forth. And why are they so important? And how they provide as well, a constant theme in one study of death in the ancient world, a way to laud the dead and often as well to laud the living, L-A-U-D, by demonstrating their connection with the prestigious dead. I think one last point on all of this is that going back to Egypt, if you'd lived in Egypt, or indeed pretty well anywhere in the ancient world, monuments to the dead would have been enormously visible. And much would have been lavished on them that we would think ought to have been spent on improving people's homes, up-to-date kitchens and so forth, toilets, etc., etc. But nonetheless, so much was spent on the dead and to satisfy them, but also as well to proclaim your connection with someone of wealth, power, and prestige.
So the final question here, you kind of mentioned in the book, is for us atheists like myself, I people always, well, not always, but sometimes question like you don't believe anything. What happens when you go? I said at best I can't know it, and none of us can at best. But yes, I don't believe in an afterlife. I've thought about it a bit. I've actually had conversations with friends of mine. I used to be of that belief of like, I don't want to live for millions of years. That sounds miserable. I would like to kind of rest at some point. But at the same time, it's I'm a seeker of knowledge and experience, and so it would be wonderful to just through time do all those things, to have no limit to that. So I am very, very sympathetic to that as well. But I said this before, and I've told this to people. I'm less worried about death for me personally. I obviously don't want to die, right? I want to live as long as I possibly can in a healthy way, quality of life. But the thing I usually fear the most is kind of what I was just getting at, is I fear mostly time. I don't have
Mhm.
enough time.
Mhm.
I want to
Mhm.
have so much experience and so much life with people, and to learn things all the time, and to know that at a certain point I won't be able to do that is what bothers me the most. When I think about, if you kind of drill down on it, it's like, well, why are you scared of dying or whatever? And it's like, well, because I won't be with my family, I won't be able to do things I enjoy. And it's like, oh, really? I think what people are concerned about is is just that you're not going to be able to have these experiences in life. And for me, that's a bit of time. I don't have enough time to do all the things I want, and so you're always making decisions and things like that, which is,
Mhm.
you know, it's okay. I mean, we don't have to be paralyzed by it. We make the decision. Okay, that's how we do it. But yeah, I think for me, it's the time thing. But yeah, what are your thoughts about death and dying and the afterlife for folks that are non-believers? And how can we you know uh, interact with people fairly and respectfully that
Mhm.
have these different ideas about the afterlife?
Well, I completely agree with you. Of course, I don't believe in the life eternal, and I have to question what it would be like anyway. Because if yes, I wish there was more time to live, although I don't want to live forever.
Right.
But when you take time out of the equation, what is left?
Yeah.
Mortality is life. Immortality is not life.
Hmm.
It's an endless round of the same. And
Hmm.
not to knock Christianity, but an early Christian saint, Saint Perpetua, who went up to heaven on a ladder and saw what was going on there, said that she saw people singing and reciting "Holy, Holy, Holy" round the non-existent clock, so to speak. That doesn't seem to me a particularly pleasurable existence.
It
Like,
sounds like torture.
it sounds exactly like torture. Yes, I
I don't
didn't
want
look
to. I don't
at
want to
it.
live forever to do one thing on one note. I
No, for
want to live
goodness
forever
sake.
to do other things.
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, and also, if there's nothing to achieve, and
Yeah.
there's you don't hold yourself responsible for your actions any longer either. So you can't be a moral being, I suppose. I don't know. I don't want to get into all that, but I
Mm,
completely agree with you. It does sound like torture. Now, one shouldn't say that, of course, to the 70% of Americans who do believe
sure.
in the
Yeah.
afterlife.
Yeah.
And they believe in the afterlife largely because they want to be reconnected with their loved ones, as you mentioned.
Of course.
And that is something I totally respect.
Yeah. Me
But
too.
one thing I will insist upon, I've had conversations with friends who have said to me, well, if you don't believe in the afterlife, Christians these are, then you can't, why be a good person? Why be a moral person? And that I completely and utterly and 1,000,000% reject. I don't think that being a good person, leading a moral life, has anything to do with what I expect or don't expect in the afterlife. I believe in what Santa says: be good for goodness sake. That to me is the rule of life, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with religion. I mean, to me, it's irrelevant, an irrelevant subject. I will try to be a good person. Now, my friends will argue back at me and they say, well, the only reason why you really think that you want to be a good person is because of Christianity, the system of belief that you grew up with, that was indoctrinated into you. And so the subject becomes circular because, then you're saying all the time, no, 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 I'm a good person or trying to be a good person because I believe that is the way I should live.
Mm,
So, for the record, I believe in goodness for its own sake without any belief in the afterlife, which is completely irrelevant. Heaven and hell, don't give me that. It doesn't matter. I think that's the only thing that I would absolutely tell a person of belief insistently. Please don't tell me that I can't be moral if I don't believe in the afterlife.
hmm hmm
I love to quote a Greek sophist
hmm
called Protagoras, who said,
hmm
concerning the gods, I neither know whether they exist or whether they don't exist. There are many obstacles for knowing. One is the shortness of human life. The other is the obscurity of the subject. And when we come down to it in the end, no one, not even the Pope, knows the answers to the questions that we are at this moment posing. Nothing to do with grief. I respect grief, absolutely, 100%. That's a quite separate issue. But as for belief in the afterlife, I ask that I be allowed to be an atheist, and I will respect you as long as you do nothing to harm animals or children.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think that, personally for me, I think people at certain points, the promise of an afterlife is some form of an evolved self-delusion that we have, or self-denial. Because if we didn't have that, we would crumble with anxiety and dread and angst, and I think we've over time evolved that, and I think a bit of that. I think if people can have some caveats with it to say, we don't really know, but I like to believe this. It helps me get through things. Okay, I mean, for other people, perfectly fine with that. I think, when it becomes terribly dogmatic and in some of the beliefs is probably less helpful. And,
Right.
and I totally agree with you. I mean, for myself, I fully agree. You have from within itself human life and the human as things that you can derive value and meaning from. And I don't need to have a deity or the promise of an afterlife to be a good, or to try to be a good person, to try and to have loving kindness, to promote the well-being and good fortune of other people. A deity and a life afterwards isn't part required for the equation to do that. And so I think that everyone is a bit different.
Yes.
I do think this is a separate conversation, of course. I do think that our valuation and our intentions do start to become more salient as we drill down on the things that people are doing. But of course, on the surface of it, good actions and behaviors, I think, are at at a bare minimum, good for folks. So, Robert, this was such a fun conversation in many ways, because it's in reading the book, it was this way too. It's not dark and gloomy because you're writing about death. I think some people have too much of that. I think how you said something in the beginning.
Not dark and gloomy.
Yeah, the way you approached it in the beginning, I really liked. It really is an interesting bit for our humanity and for our history about how we really think about what it means to live, to think about what it means to move on, and what you've done is to try and help us understand that a bit more. And really, it's just another way of or perspective of looking about what it means to be human and how we have been living and continue to live. And so, in that way, it's such a masterful job. And I really, really appreciate you coming on and talking about it and giving us your wisdom. I'm much appreciated.
I've enjoyed it so much, Javier.
Yeah.
Terrific questions, covering so much ground.
Yeah.
And one last thing, if I may, just something that you said a moment ago, and that is that one of the reasons that religion is powerful is because people resort to it at the time when they are getting close to the end, and that is understandable, but unnecessary as well, I believe. And I always think of a moment in a play by Euripides, the Hippolytus, when Hippolytus is dying, and he's a favorite of Artemis, and Artemis says, "Oh, sorry, I've got to go now, because otherwise I will be contaminated, polluted by death." So, the Greeks got through life and death without the consolation of religion.
Yeah.
They may have, some of them believed that there would be blessedness, but largely they were in it on their own. And that, I think, is, I'd like to say, where we will be, sort of able to face death on its own terms as mortals, without relying on any expectation that something will happen that will sort of sort things out for us at that moment.
Yeah.
We may be wrong. Who knows?
Right. Yeah, I think I totally agree. Well, thanks so much, Robert.
Thank
Really
you, Greg.
appreciate it.